For generations, many people were told that the Pathans came from one lost tribe, one hidden bloodline, one ancient secret. But when science began to look closer, the answer did not point to one vanished tribe at all. It pointed to a far older, far wider human story. If this mystery lives anywhere near your own roots, stay with me to the end, because the final truth is not just about DNA. It is about what people choose to remember and what history refuses to say in simple words. The story most people hear is powerful for a reason. It sounds clean, it sounds dramatic, it sounds unforgettable. The Pathans, also called Pashtuns, are sometimes said to descend from the lost tribes of Israel. It is a story that has traveled through families, old writings, local tradition, and public imagination for a very long time. Some people have pointed to tribal names. Some have pointed to customs. Some have said the clues were always there, hiding in plain sight. That is why this idea never really died. It gives people a legendary beginning. It turns identity into a mystery. It makes the past feel personal. And maybe most of all, it offers something human beings have always wanted. A straight answer to the question, where did we come from? And for a while, many thought that if science ever stepped into this mystery, it would finally give a simple yes or a simple no. But history almost never rewards that kind of hope, because the first thing scientists found was not a neat line leading back to one tribe. It was noise, layers, contradictions, different signals coming from different parts of the family tree. And that is where this story starts to change. The old belief did not appear from nowhere. Some Pashtun oral traditions speak of Israelite descent. Some writers in the past treated the idea seriously. Some observers even pointed to customs they believed looked similar to Jewish traditions, like certain food rules, wedding practices, or old symbolic habits. Names like Yusufzai were tied by some to Joseph. Afridi was linked by some to Ephraim, so the story kept breathing. It kept moving from generation to generation because it did not feel random. It felt meaningful. But meaningful is not the same as proven. That is the line where emotion and evidence begin to pull apart. Even people who found the theory fascinating warned that fascination is not proof. Researchers who looked at the question carefully said the idea was debated. They said DNA might help show what broad region a people came from, but that did not mean it could neatly confirm one dramatic ancestral claim. In other words, the legend could be old, powerful, and important, and still not be a literal map of genetic origin. That is a hard thing for people to hear, because when a story lives inside a community for a long time, it stops feeling like a theory. It starts to feel like memory. And memory is strong. Memory can survive even when records are gone. Memory can cross mountains, wars, borders, and silence. But memory can also reshape itself. It can protect pride. It can carry pain. It can turn scattered clues into a full picture, even when parts of that picture are still missing. So what happened when scientists stopped listening only to the story and started listening to the DNA? What they found was not one voice. It was a choir. If you grew up hearing one version of this origin story, tell me the first word that comes to your mind right now. Tribe, blood, myth, or home? To understand why the answer became so complicated, you need to know one simple thing. DNA does not speak with one mouth. Some parts of it help trace the line that comes down through mothers. Some help trace the line that comes down through fathers. And when researchers compared those lines in Pathan and nearby populations, they did not get one clean message repeated over and over. They got different patterns. And that matters more than it may seem, because if one people truly came from one tight, isolated ancestral source, you would expect the picture to feel more narrow, more singular, more locked in place. But that was not the picture. A genetic study from the region of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa found that the paternal and maternal gene pools in the local populations included West Eurasian, South Asian, and East Asian lineages. Read that again. In plain language, the evidence did not point to one source. It pointed to multiple streams, not one door, many doors. And it got even more interesting. The same research showed that the patterns from mother lines and father lines were not the same. They were fairly different. That means the human story behind these communities was not simple. Men and women did not always move in the same way, mix in the same way, or come from the same places at the same time. The past was not marching forward in one straight line. It was turning, splitting, merging, and changing. In one part of that research, most of the Y chromosome results did not gather under one single marker either. They spread across several major haplogroups. One was large, others were also clearly present. That alone should make us careful. A people with a deep and mixed regional history will not leave behind the fingerprint of one tiny closed circle. They will leave behind a layered map. And that is exactly what the studies began to show. One mitochondrial DNA study described Pashtuns as a composite mosaic. That is such an important phrase. A composite mosaic. Not a pure block, not a sealed container. A mosaic. Pieces from different places joined into one living whole. That changes everything. Because once the science starts saying mosaic, the old dream of one legendary genetic origin begins to slip. Not because the people are less real, not because the culture is less deep, not because the old stories meant nothing, but because the biological history looks older, broader, and more regional than the popular myth suggests. And then another major clue appeared. A Y chromosome study on Afghanistan's ethnic groups found that all current Afghans largely share heritage from a common ancestral population that likely goes back to the Neolithic age, to very early farming communities. The differences between groups became stronger later, during the Bronze Age and after. In plain English, the research did not support the idea that Pashtuns stood apart as a people with one isolated origin cut off from everyone around them. It suggested shared deep roots, followed by later shaping, mixing, and separation over time. That is not a small correction. That is a full shift in how you tell the story. Because now the question is no longer, did the Pathans come from one lost tribe? Now the question becomes, why did we ever expect a people from this region to come from just one source at all? And once that question enters the room, the whole mystery gets bigger. Stay with this next part, because this is where the story stops being about a single claim and starts becoming a map of human movement. The same Afghanistan study found a notable genetic affinity linking Pashtuns and Tajiks with North and West Indian populations. It also pointed to gene flow from India into Afghanistan that seemed to involve Pashtuns and Tajiks more than some other groups. Think about what that means. It means the Pathan story is not just a story of one people looking backward to one distant tribe. It is also a story tied to the wider region around them, to long contact, long movement, and long shared ancestry across neighboring lands. So the picture becomes harder to simplify. You have old oral traditions that point one way. You have genetic patterns that point many ways. You have a regional history that refuses to stay inside one border. You have a people whose identity is strong, but whose ancestry appears layered. And that is exactly why this topic creates so much emotion. Because people often hear mixed ancestry as a threat. They should not. Mixed ancestry is not confusion. It is history. Shared roots are not weakness. They are depth. A complex origin is not a broken story. It is the most human story of all. Still, the tension does not disappear. In fact, it gets sharper. Because if the science suggests a broad regional ancestry instead of one narrow legendary line, then why did the lost tribe story become so powerful in the first place? That is the next door in this mystery. And behind it is something more personal than genetics. Before we open that door, leave a comment with the story you heard growing up. Because for many families, this is not just research. It is inheritance. The truth is, people do not build identity out of lab reports. They build it out of names, memory, pride, pain, honor, faith, and survival. A community does not wake up one day and choose a grand origin story for no reason. Stories grow where history leaves a wound, a gap, or longing. They grow where records are broken. They grow where power changes hands. They grow where people need to explain who they are in a world that keeps trying to explain them from the outside. That may be one reason the Pathan origin story became so charged. Because it was never only about genes. It was about belonging. It was about dignity. It was about answering the oldest human fear of all. If we do not know exactly where we began, can others rewrite us? This is why the science can feel unsettling even when it is not insulting. When people hear that the DNA points to West Eurasian, South Asian, and East Asian lineages, some may hear dilution. But that is the wrong way to hear it. What the science is really saying is that the ancestors of these communities were part of a vast human zone of contact. They were not frozen outside of history. They were inside history, deep inside it, old enough to carry many layers, local enough to share roots with surrounding peoples, distinct enough to still become who they became. That is not less impressive than a lost tribe legend. It may be more impressive, because one single bloodline is easy to imagine. A people formed through centuries of movement, memory, separation, survival, and cultural strength is much harder to create. And yet, that is what the evidence seems to suggest. There's another reason this subject becomes so intense. People often confuse ancestry with identity, as if they are the same thing. They are not. Ancestry is about lines of descent. Identity is about a living people. Ancestry can be mixed. Identity can still be strong. Ancestry can be old and layered. Identity can still be clear. DNA can tell you that your forefathers and foremothers came through different roots. It can tell you your population shares deep roots with neighboring groups. It can tell you the story is older than a legend. But it cannot fully measure what a people became together. And that is the hidden center of this whole mystery. The studies do not erase the Pathans. They explain why their origin is bigger than one claim. In fact, one of the most striking things about the regional data is that father lines and mother lines tell different stories. That means the past was shaped by real human lives, not by myths written after the fact. Men moved, women moved, families joined, communities formed, boundaries hardened, boundaries softened. Over time, a people emerged with its own memory, its own codes, its own name, and its own sense of itself. That is how real history works. Not as a straight beam of light, more like fire passing from hand to hand. And once you see it that way, the old myth and the new science stop being enemies. They become different kinds of truth. One truth asks, what story did people tell about who they were? The other asks, what does the biological record suggest about how they formed? Those are not identical questions, so we should not expect identical answers. Now here is where the mystery tightens again. If the evidence does not strongly support one isolated Israelite origin, does that mean the old story was simply false? Not so fast. Science is good at testing certain claims. It is not good at reducing human memory to a yes or no stamp. A legend can preserve fragments of contact, fragments of resemblance, fragments of old belief, or fragments of pride, even if the full story later grows beyond what genes can prove. At the same time, a legend can also stretch, absorb, and reshape itself over centuries until it becomes more symbolic than literal. That is why careful language matters here. Some researchers believe the old theory deserves curiosity. The evidence suggests the genetic picture is far more mixed and regional. Historians still debate how older stories should be read. And none of that gives us permission to turn uncertainty into certainty. That matters. Because once people become emotionally attached to a dramatic origin, they often stop wanting truth and start wanting victory. But truth is rarely a victory march. Truth is usually humbling. If this is making you rethink what the word origin really means, stay with the last turns of this story, because the biggest reveal is not about where the Pathans did not come from. It is about what kind of answer science is really giving. Imagine standing in front of a huge old wall made of stone. From far away, it looks like one thing. Up close, you see that it is made of many stones, shaped by different hands, laid down at different times, worn by different winds, but still forming one wall. That may be the closest image for what the genetic research suggests. The Pathan story, at least genetically, does not look like a single untouched line hidden from the rest of the region. It looks like a deep regional formation, shared ancestry, multiple inputs, later separations, local identity becoming stronger. Over time, a people emerging not from isolation, but from history itself. And when you say it like that, something unexpected happens. The story becomes less exotic, but more real, less cinematic in the mythic sense, but far more moving in the human sense. Because now you're no longer talking about one magical answer dropped from the sky. You are talking about generations of real people. People who loved, married, fought, migrated, adapted, remembered, forgot, and carried fragments of older worlds inside them. That is what DNA keeps finding. Again and again in many parts of human history. Not simple purity, not neat borders, not one perfect ancestral box, but movement, contact, and survival. Still, the Pathan case carries a special emotional charge, because identity here has never been a cold academic issue. It touches family honor, tribal memory, religion, language, and the way people explain themselves to outsiders. That is why shallow answers can do real damage. If you tell the story too simply, you flatten a living people. If you tell it carelessly, you turn science into a weapon. And if you turn legend into unquestioned fact, you stop listening to what the evidence is actually saying. So what is the evidence saying in the clearest possible way? It says the Pathans do not appear to come from one single isolated genetic origin. It says their ancestry includes lineages tied to West Eurasian, South Asian, and East Asian sources. It says maternal and paternal lines do not tell the exact same story. It says Pashtuns share deep roots with other Afghan populations from an ancient common background. It says later patterns of difference formed over time. It says the popular lost tribe claim remains debated, fascinating, and emotionally powerful, but not established by the genetic findings we have. That is the center of the matter. And if you were expecting a cleaner answer, that disappointment may actually be the beginning of wisdom. Because history is not here to comfort our need for simple origin myths. History is here to remind us that human beings were always crossing into one another's worlds. That is especially true in places where cultures meet, blend, harden, and survive over long stretches of time. In such places, identity becomes strong not because ancestry is narrow, but because the people who inherit that ancestry build something lasting out of it. This is why the phrase real genetic origin can be a little dangerous if we do not use it carefully. It can make people think there must be one final hidden label, one secret tribe, one last dramatic reveal that ends the argument forever. But science is not uncovering one final label here. Science is uncovering a process A very old process, a regional human story, a braided origin. And a braided origin is still an origin. It just asks more of us. It asks us to be mature enough to accept that identity can be real without being genetically simple. It asks us to understand that a people can have strong memory and still have mixed ancestry. It asks us to see that being ancient does not mean being untouched. That is the lesson sitting quietly beneath all the noise. If someone in your life still believes ancestry always runs in a straight line, send them this story, because the past almost never moves in straight lines. There's also something beautiful here that people often miss. When a legend says, we came from somewhere great, it is trying to protect meaning. When science says, your roots are broad, layered, and shared, it is also protecting meaning, but in a different way. It is saying your ancestors were part of a world larger than one tribe's story. It is saying they were not small. It is saying they stood where histories met. It is saying their descendants carry that depth forward. And maybe that is why this topic keeps returning. Because beneath the argument, beneath the pride, beneath the debate about names and blood and old claims, there's a more fragile question hiding in the dark. What if people fear complexity because they think it makes them less special? But it does not. A people forged through centuries of contact, memory, and survival are not less special than a people imagined as descendants of one lost tribe. They may be more remarkable because they did not inherit one ready-made legend alone. They became one. And that brings us to the final turn. The real surprise in this story is not that the popular version may be too simple. The real surprise is that the truth may be bigger than the myth. The myth says one secret line explains everything. The evidence says no single line can explain a people this old, this rooted, and this shaped by so many layers of history. The myth offers one ancestor. The evidence offers a human landscape. The myth gives you a dramatic origin. The evidence gives you a deeper one. So when someone asks, where did the Pathans really come from, the most honest answer may be this. They seem to come from the long human history of the region itself, from ancient shared roots, from different streams of ancestry that met over time, from father lines and mother lines that do not always match, from old communities that became distinct while still carrying echoes of many older worlds, and from the power of culture to turn a complex past into a living people. That answer may not fit into one slogan, but it feels closer to the truth. And maybe that is what makes it so powerful. Because in the end, the deepest lesson here is not about proving one legend right or wrong. It is about learning that identity is not shattered by complexity. It is revealed by it. The Pathans do not become less real because their genetic story appears mixed, regional, and ancient. They become more human, more connected to the long movement of history, more connected to the land around them, more connected to the truth that almost every people on Earth carries. We are older, more layered, and less simple than the stories told about us. And maybe that is the line that should stay with you after this ends. Not that the mystery disappeared, but that the mystery grew up. It stopped being a hunt for one lost tribe and became something harder, richer, and far more moving. A story about how people are made. A story about how memory and science can look at the same past and see different things. A story about how blood alone never tells the whole truth. And a story about how sometimes the real origin of a people is not one hidden answer waiting to be found. It is the vast, unfinished record of everyone who came before, and the identity their descendants chose to carry forward.